We have with us now John Corrigan, who established Group 8 Education and is going to tell you more about what he gets up to. Talking of opening minds, I've mentioned opening minds, he's a man who's opened his own mind and regularly opens other people's minds. And then finally, talking about listening, which is the topic of today's session from John. John and I have come across each other in other places, and one of them recently is the Listen Here campaign, global campaign for effective listening, where John has made some fascinating, insightful contributions. So I'm now going to listen. I'm going to stop talking and listen and sit down. And I would very much like to introduce our speaker and facilitator for the day, John Corrigan.
Our ability to listen develops in the womb very early on, not much after the development of the spinal cord. So it is the first sense that develops, and in fact we can listen in the womb. We can listen when we're asleep. We can hear a child's soft cry, yet we'll sleep through, if you live in Leichhardt, a jet coming into land early in the morning. Listening is probably the most powerful of our senses, yet we tend not to think of it in that way. Vision is something that we tend to see as being the dominant sense because it's, I suppose, we have a panoramic view of the world, and so we tend to see that as being the more important sense. But I'd like to show you today why listening is so important, why it's so important now, and particularly why it's important to all of us. So to start off on this journey, I'd like you to turn to the person next to you, introduce yourself, and then say to them something that is extraordinary or unusual or different about you.
Thank you.
Now that you know each other, would you like to now just share with each other a time in your life when you've been at your best, when you've been optimistic, collaborative, creative, when you felt at your best? So share with a person a time in your life when you've been at your best. Now, to understand why listening is important, we need to go back to the very basics, which is around how we grow and develop as children and as adults. And to do that, we need to start with the brain. And we have what's called a triune or tripartite brain, which is a way of saying that the brain has 3 bits to it. Now, this is a relatively simple, if not simplistic, view of the brain. It has its limitations. Our brains are massively dynamic, massively connected. But this model is useful in 2 ways. One is that the reptilian brain, which is what this part is called, has the parts which I suppose our reptilian ancestors had. So it has fight and flight. It has lots of the automatic processes that our body needs to function within the world. The limbic system, or midbrain or mammalian brain, is what made mammals successful. It allowed adults to have feelings for their offspring, and therefore to care for their offspring, and indeed to care for each other. And this is in fact where moods, feelings, emotions originate within us. And then the third part of the brain, the human brain, the cortex, the neocortex, is really what makes us human. So one way this model is useful is that from an evolutionary point of view, we do have stepwise layered capability, which is a long-winded way of saying that nature doesn't reinvent stuff. So stuff that worked for our reptilian ancestors in terms of fight-flight Still works today, so we still have it in that form. But the second way that this is useful is that this is the order in which the brain grows in the womb through childhood and into adulthood. And so although our brains are 95% complete by the age of about 6, they're not fully physically developed till our mid-20s. So there's a very long development process for our brain. And that leads then to the lived experience, to the observed experience, that the childhood mind is a distinctly different thing from the adult mind. And it's different because it is based on the parts of the brain that are most developed up till the age of about 10, and those parts of the brain are the most primitive parts of the brain. So the childhood mind has the characteristics of the more primitive parts of the brain. That is, it's self-centered, it's impulsive, as we know. Emotions tend to be overwhelming. That is, I'm perfectly happy building my pile of bricks, and I'm completely outraged when somebody kicks them over. I have no real view of the future. So if I'm happy today, I've got a happy future. And if I'm sad today, I've got an unhappy future. And I'm cautious in engaging with the world. So if somebody shouts at me for doing something, I'm going to hesitate in doing that thing again. If I touch something hot, I'm going to be cautious about touching something that looks like that again. So this is the childhood mind, and it's the dominant mind state up until the age of about 10. From 10 onwards, the adult mind begins to evolve. The adult mind is what makes us human. This is the seat of self-awareness, our ability to expand self-awareness through higher order learning, our ability to socialize, our ability to imagine a future different from today, our ability to plan to get there, to see how well we're doing, our ability to control our impulses, so put off gratification for tomorrow, for something that we'd really like to do today. When the adult mind is fully developed, we are at our best. We are optimistic, we're collaborative, we're creative. We are at our best. So the process of education then is simply one of leading the child out of the childhood mind and into the adult mind. And in fact, our word education comes from Latin educare, which in turn comes from two Latin words, ex and ducere, meaning to lead out of. So education has always been seen as this process of leading the child out of the childhood mind and into the adult mind. So how do we do that? From the Second World War onwards, we've organised education around content, around curriculum. So engaging children with interesting and challenging curriculum is a way to develop the adult mind. And indeed, as adults, for us to get into the best possible mind state, the easiest way is to engage with interesting and challenging content. Do a crossword, look at great art, read literature, have an interesting discussion, and that will lift us up into the adult, fully into the adult mind state. The question then is what to do with the childhood mind state, because it isn't just going to go away. It's been the dominant one for 10 years, so what do we do with it? Historically, what we've done is we've allowed the childhood mind state to persist into adulthood. And when it does, we call it the red zone. So we call the childhood mind state in adulthood the red zone, and we call the adult mind state in adulthood the blue zone. It's the red zone and the blue zone is a language that we use. So what does this mean? Well, let me give you an example of it. Imagine you're in a supermarket and you're in a checkout queue, and there are multiple checkout queues, and you notice that all the other queues are going faster than yours. If you find yourself thinking, this always happens to me, then that is the red zone, that is the childhood mind state that's persisted into adulthood triggering. It is self-centered and pessimistic. This always happens to me. Now, if you imagine that you don't have a red zone, imagine you're driving into a car park, one of these multi-storey ones with a one-way system, and the car park's pretty full. And you get onto a long straight, and 3/4 of the way down the straight, you see an empty parking space. So you think, my parking space. As you drive towards it, a car comes screaming down in the opposite direction, and it goes into that parking space. If you're able to smile, drive past, and be completely focused on looking for the next empty space, then you have no red zone. I have yet to find somebody who is able to do that. Now, in times of certainty, when the future is predictable, having an active red zone is not a major problem. But in times of uncertainty, when we face up to difficulties, challenges, things which are scary, then having an active red zone becomes a real liability. Because we can be happily operating in our adult mind, in the blue zone, then something scary, difficult, challenging happens, and it knocks us out of that. We get into the red zone, and then we only have available to us the very limited repertoire that the childhood mind has. We can't socialise, we can't solve complex problems, so we end up, in a sense, paralysed in the face of difficulty. And of course, that's the situation that we're in now. And particularly for our children, who see an uncertain future in front of them, they realise that they have to be able to face up to that uncertain future with all of their faculties available to them. So a much better way of handling the childhood mind then is, rather than allowing it to persist into adulthood, is to quieten it down, to allow it just to dissipate away, and that it only be triggered at times of real danger. So if you're about to be hit by a bus, you do want to find yourself back on the pavement without having thought very much about it. But if you're standing up in a room of people speaking, you don't want sweat pouring off your palms or your heart hammering, which are all phenomena triggered by the fight-flight, by the red zone. So it turns out that the way that we can quieten down the childhood mind in a child is when that child is engaged by a person. So what does engaged by a person mean? It means that no matter how I behave as a child, no matter how I perform as a child, the response of the adult, be it a parent or a teacher, the response of the adult is always an adult one. That is, the teacher or the parent doesn't demean me, doesn't belittle me, doesn't get angry with me, doesn't get frustrated with me, doesn't get irritated, but the response of the adult is an adult one. And that has the effect of allowing the child to shift its brain's resources up into the modern part of the brain, so glucose and sugar, and to cause that child to be able to face up to difficult, scary, challenging things without dropping out of the adult mind. And because we're creatures of habit, if we do that a number of times, we're able to do that in the absence of the teacher or the parent. And that's called resilience. So the way that we build resilience in children, that is their capacity to face up to an uncertain future with their capacities, the full faculties available to them, is to engage them in this way. Now, there are two other groups that are arising in society at the moment who do this, but who do it for adults. Can anybody think of what one of those groups might be? Well, the most obvious group is coaches. We've seen an explosion of cognitive coaching over the last 15 years. So what cognitive coaching does is hold an adult in the adult mind so they can face up to difficult, scary, challenging circumstances and build clarity and commitment to a course of action to move forward. And they've arisen over the last 15 years in response to exactly the same problem. The third group that's arising is what's called third generation leaders. So what third generation leaders do is exactly the same thing. They are successful because they create the conditions for their staff, for their followers, to be at their best. That is, to be optimistic, collaborative, creative, and they do it in the same way. Now, outstanding teachers represent about 1 in 20 of all teachers. And in fact, as successful adults, on average, you'll probably remember 2 in your own schooling. And if you go through the numbers, that works out at about 1 in 20. So they've always been with us, but they don't seem to be getting any more common. Yet clearly, the outstanding teacher, the teacher who can do this, has had a significant impact on us becoming who we are, and similarly can have a significant impact on children today on becoming who they need to be. Now, we've seen that one of the things an outstanding teacher does to be able to engage a child in this way is to respond to the child in a way that we call is unconditionally respectful. And if we look at respect, then what we call unconditional downwards is the characteristic that outstanding teachers have, that coaches have, that third generation leaders have. That is the capacity to, no matter how the child behaves, no matter how the child performs, to be able to respond to the child always in an adult way. Coaches do the same. Coaches are not shocked or disgusted or judgmental about things that their coaches say. In fact, it's important that they accept unconditionally what is said to allow the coaching process to work. Now, respect means different things to different people, and there are at least 3 forms of respect. The form that underpins our education system today, and indeed our society, is what we call conditional two-way respect. Conditional two-way respect is, if you do what I want you to do, I'll be good to you, but if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to sanction you or punish you in some way. So more than 90% of teachers offer conditional respect to children, and only a small number offer unconditional respect. But the third form of respect is what we call unconditional upwards. And this is what underpinned 19th century or Victorian education. Victorian being the woman, not the state. And unconditional respect upwards is, no matter how I behave as the teacher or the boss, you, the child or the worker, must respect me. You don't see much of that around, but you do see the odd person who has that as a form of respect. Now, the other thing that makes outstanding teachers outstanding is the way that they listen to children. And that really is the core of what we want to talk about now, is how we listen. Now, you may or may not know, but we're able to listen on 4 distinctly different levels, which is odd, because we only see on one level, yet we can listen on 4 different levels. And the reason seems to be that those 4 different levels open up different processing pathways in the brain. That is, we can process what we hear differently at the different levels of listening. So the most superficial level of listening is what's called downloading. That is, I'm listening to you, but all I'm hearing is what confirms my own views, my own beliefs, my own prejudices. Now, this can happen when we're fearful or in a panic. That is, you've done something you shouldn't have done, and you think you're going to lose your job. You go into a meeting with a person who's going to decide whether or not you've lost your job, and all you are listening for is confirmation that you haven't lost your job. Everything else just goes straight over your head. In downloading, essentially no learning takes place. All we're doing is confirming what we believe, what we fear. We're just confirming what we already know. The second level of listening is called attentive listening. That is, I'm listening to you, and what I'm hearing is what's different in what you're saying to what I myself believe, and then I use that difference to try and convince you that I'm right. So my ability to mount an argument improves, but again, there is little, if any, learning taking place at the attentive listening level. Now, the third level is empathic listening. And empathic listening is very interesting. At empathic listening, we begin to see the world as another person sees it. We begin to feel it as they feel it. We know how we see the world. We know how we feel about it. And then we draw a conclusion and we come up with a new piece of knowledge. And this is called serial processing. So empathic listening allows us to serially process information. It allows us to take 2 different bits of information and come up with a conclusion. So at empathic listening, we begin to learn. We're able to change our underlying views. And empathic listening is also extraordinarily useful to the person who's being listened to. There's an organisation in the UK called Kids Co, and they help extremely damaged children to get back to being operating in a normal range and then to grow constructively. And at the core of what they do is simply to listen to children in this way, where they are not shocked or disgusted or judgmental about the child, but they simply listen to the child, which begins to allow the child to feel an attachment to a human and to begin to feel understood. So empathic listening is extraordinarily powerful. But there is a fourth level of listening, which is the most powerful of all, and that's called emergent listening. And we've all experienced emergent listening. And emergent listening is when we have an almost visceral sense that yes, we can do something, or yes, the future could be different. In coaching, it's the aha moment, the sense of, yeah, I could do that. And the reason we have that is emergent listening gives us access to parallel processing within the brain. And parallel processing allows us to connect the dots. So it allows us to connect things that we've heard in the past, things that we're hearing now, things that we're thinking, connects all of that together, and it brings out this sense of, yeah, it could be different. Yes, I could do this. When we experience emergent listening, we are changed. That is, our view of the world changes, our view of ourselves changes. So emergent listening is a phenomenally powerful way of listening. Now, when I work with whole school staffs, at this point, I ask them, the students in your class, at what level would you like them to be listening? And I think it's fairly straightforward that the response is at the empathic and emergent levels. And then my follow-up question is, so how are they going to learn how to do that? And then you can see the lights coming on around the room. That the only way children will learn how to do this is if adults model it to them. And this is what outstanding teachers do. Outstanding teachers listen to children at the empathic and emergent levels, which allows the teacher themselves to learn. That is, their view of themselves, their view of the world changes as they do this, and they are modeling this behavior to children, and thereby children learn how to do this. And if a child at the age of 5 learns how to do emergent listening, then they will be a lifelong learner. No matter what set of circumstances they get put into, they will learn from those circumstances. It is a great, great gift to give to a child the capacity to listen empathically and emergently, and they will only learn that if an adult models it to them. Now, out of these two, we can drive a sets of behaviours. So out of unconditional respect downwards, we call it powerful questioning, but it's a way of responding to somebody that elicits this sense of unconditional respect. And at the listening level, we call it observational listening, but again, it's a set of behaviours that gives us access to the empathic and emergent levels. And in fact, any form of coaching would have its own two sets of behaviours that fit with this. Now, what I'd like to do is to practice some observational listening, so you get a sense of how to access empathic and emergent listening. So, listening exercise part 1, which implies there is a part 2. So, with the person next to you, in this exercise, one of you will be a speaker and one of you will be a listener. So, the speaker simply talk about an issue that you'd like to resolve. It might be in your personal life, professional life, whatever, but something that you're struggling with. So just talk it through. And listener, listen to the other person. You can ask questions, you can engage in a conversation, so it is a two-way thing. But as you are listening, monitor what's happening inside your mind. So monitor what thoughts are popping into your head as you're listening to the other person, what you find yourself saying, what you find yourself hearing, what's happening inside your head. So does anybody not understand those simple instructions? Good. So with your partner, choose who's to be the speaker, who's to be the listener, and I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to go through this. So, listeners, What did you find popping into your mind as you were listening to the other person speaking?
I found Penelope was discussing a matter that not only have I heard other people experience, but I've also experienced, and I found myself starting to think about me. Because I do coach people, I knew to go, shut up, Tracy, it's not about you, it's about Penelope, and shut up, and went back to the listening. But I did find for a short period of time, I started going into my world rather than staying in Penelope.
Yeah, very, very common. We hear something that matches our own experience, and it can take us down a whole stream of completely tangential thought unless we put a stop to it. Yeah. What else?
I was evaluating. I was really happy with what Mark came up with, his subject matter. It was about a child. And I thought, oh, great. And he was talking about his own child. And I thought, oh, maybe he's just making that up. Maybe he really doesn't have a child. And then, then I was thinking to myself, it doesn't matter. I really like what he's brought up, and I really like the pros and cons that he's mentioned.
Yeah.
So I was evaluating.
Yeah. Judgment is normally the way we would use that, but that's very common too. Often people don't admit to it, but it is a common thing that occurs in our minds.
Ben was describing to me a problem in his life and various different approaches that he took to it, and I found that I was evaluating his approach as well, but perhaps on a different level. Like, I found myself almost consciously putting myself at the empathic kind of listening level when he said something that worked for him, but when he said that when he started describing something that didn't work for him, I was more of an attentive listener, almost as if, I tried to disagree with the same things that he disagreed with.
Yeah.
Kind of
I actually thought it was more like a shared journey, because we started just trying to be the empathic. I thought, I've had these experiences, and so just plotting, I thought we were going down that sort of similar path. So I actually, as I say, maybe it's a little bit of myself, I was trying to sort of distance, but then as asking the questions, it sort of was prodding him along the journey that I was actually following myself through that experience.
I think what that illustrates is that there's an awful lot going on inside our minds as we're listening to somebody else. And we find that they often fit into a number of categories. So thoughts that are judging is one of those, which is clearly a downloading type of listening. It's sort of assertive. Thoughts that are fitting or matching previous experiences, which can then lead us down a track, very common. Thoughts that are making assumptions. So even to the extent of finishing somebody's sentence in your own mind before they've finished it themselves. Thoughts that trigger processing. I don't think anybody mentioned it really here, but this is very common, particularly for successful people. We are used to solving problems on a day-to-day basis, so we tend to fall into that. We process, we contrast, we formulate, we try to solve the problems that we're hearing. Completely unrelated trains of thought. I need to buy a bag of potatoes on the way home. Now, most of this is attentive and downloading, and perhaps a little bit of empathic. To be able to get at empathic and emergent listening, we have to quieten all of this down, because this is getting in the way of us being able to listen at the most profound levels. Our attention is limited. So if our attention is on this, it means it's not on something else. And what we need to do is to work out a way of having our attention available for empathic and emergent listening. So the next part of this exercise then is the same pairs. The person who is speaking continue to speak about the same sort of thing, but this time, listener, allow what's being said to wash over you, to wash through you, to wash past you, as though you're standing in the water and the river's just flowing past. And then choose out of what's being said key words or key ideas and emotions that you see. So at the end of a period, you'd be able to say, I've heard you say this, this, and this, and you were clearly excited or angry or frustrated by that. So allow what's being said to wash through you, over you, past you, then pick out key words, key emotions. Now, if you've got any attention left, then focus that attention on the other person. So look at their eyes, their eyebrows, their hair, their ears, their mouth, their teeth. Just focus your attention on the other person so that your attention is not on you. Okay? Now I'm going to give you 45 seconds to do this. And at the end of that 45 seconds, I'm going to give you 60 seconds, a minute, to feed back to the other person what it is that you've heard. Okay? So I'm going to count you in. So get yourselves ready. Speakers, you continue to speak. I'll count you in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, listeners, you've got 60 seconds to feed back what you've just heard. Okay, can you now swap direction? So speaker becomes listener, listener becomes speaker. And we'll do exactly the same thing again. So swap over. Okay, listeners, feed back to the other person what you've heard. Okay, so when you were the speaker in our exercise, when you were the speaker, did you feel listened to?
Well done, right.
Thank you, Stephen. When you were the listener, what did it take, or what would it take to do that well?
Lots of experiences and reminders
Lots of experiences and reminders in terms of
to do this
yeah,
in real life.
yeah. So some effort on your own part to do this. Yeah. What else?
Maybe strategies to keep it, to stray from those negative thoughts we have, all those, the downloading kind of listening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those thoughts that are just, that come in and we don't need.
That's right. And that's an active red zone that's causing that. So what practicing listening at the empathic and emergent is doing is actually quietening down our own red zones.
To try to withhold making judgments or offering solutions if someone is stating a problem.
What coaching has shown is that one of the most effective ways to help somebody is to help them to think better about how to solve their own problem, as opposed to trying to tell them what you think they should do, or indeed judge them and think there's no point in them trying because you don't think they're going to be able to do it anyway, which is probably the worst thing we could do.
I think perhaps going into those conversations with a quiet mind, just preparing for it, so actually quietening yourself down before you enter that sort of conversation.
Yeah.
Can I just make a point that that's very much a dream state that I'd love to be in, but in the course of my day-to-day activities, I may have to have hundreds of conversations, and while I'm having hundreds of conversations, I'm thinking about what else I need to be doing to that time. I'd like to have a trade-off with the speaker whereby I will give them 2 minutes or 3 minutes or something like that, and I will listen to them, all right, on the understanding that it only goes on for 2 to 3 minutes. Yeah. And so if I can impose a deadline, I'll listen in return. Is that horrible? Is that merciful?
No, not at all. No. And it's a much more effective way. You're more useful to the other person. You're more useful to yourself if you indeed do that. Because it's your attention they need.
Yes.
And if you're not giving it to them, why have the conversation at all?
Yeah.
So if you're going to have the conversation, give the attention.
Yeah.
And then finish it, yeah. And there are strategies to do that. Sorts of questions you ask to avoid having a long conversation. Yeah. What else?
Is it complicated a little by the purpose of the speaker speaking? You say there are several ways of listening, 4 ways of listening, but presumably there are other ways, there are also several different ways of speaking. People just want to download, they just want to dump, they just want to talk. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you're a fence post or a person. They'll still say the same thing.
Yeah, this is really largely in the context of where you want to help another person to be successful. So as a teacher, as a leader, as a colleague within some form of a team. But clearly there are times where people just want to vent. Yeah, I just want to get it off my chest, and just allow it to wash over is probably the best thing you can do in those circumstances. So what else does it take to do this well?
The big learning I got from the exercise is it's really difficult to try and let it wash through you. Because if you try and let it wash through you, you need to get all your judgments out of the way, all those bits and pieces. So personally, I can only speak for myself, it can be quite intense, focusing on the other person 100%, and then a bit like you're taught with mindfulness in Buddhism, that was just a thought that's unrelated to Chris. You know, let it go, otherwise you might miss something really important he's saying.
Yeah. Our brain misses very little. The verbal part of our brain is less than a quarter of the whole of the brain. So the rest of the brain actually picks up a lot. In fact, when we allow stuff to wash through us, we actually pick up more than if we're using our executive part of the brain to filter what we're hearing, which is essentially what attentive and downloading is doing. It's filtering what's coming through. So if we don't filter, we actually hear more, which is what allows us, our brain, to work out a different way of viewing the world, because it's allowing stuff that's unfiltered to come through. Let me talk a little bit about dislike. We sometimes take an instant dislike to people, and there are a number of reasons why we might dislike somebody. In fact, there are 3 reasons. One is there's something that we dislike in ourselves, we see it in somebody else, it generates a negative emotion, our red zone is triggered, and we interpret that negative emotion as dislike for the other person. So that's one form of dislike. Another form is, at the age 5, we were playing in the playground, and somebody came up and pushed us over, and they happened to have a particular facial shape or particular style of hair. And when we see that facial shape or that style of hair today, it recalls the associated memory and the negative emotion, and we interpret that negative emotion as dislike for the other person. The third reason is they might be a complete bastard, and therefore we don't like them. But if we take an instant dislike to somebody, it's usually one of those first two reasons. And if we take a dislike to somebody, then we don't listen to them. In fact, quite often, whatever they say, we immediately make the judgment that it's wrong or stupid or incorrect because we've disliked that person. Observational listening or practices like that is a way of getting past dislike. So if you focus your attention on the person and allow what they say to just wash past you, then in about a minute or 2 minutes, the dislike will dissipate, because you're starving that part of your brain of resources. And if it doesn't have resources, it can't sustain the emotion of dislike, and therefore that emotion will disappear. Similarly, if you come across somebody who's speaking and they're completely boring, well, you've made a judgment, these people are completely boring. If you listen to them in this way, then that feeling of boringness will also dissipate, will also disappear. So this is an extraordinarily powerful way of being able to connect to other human beings, even when the primitive part of our brain is throwing up all of these things like dislike and boringness to get in the way of connections with somebody else. So let's move on. Where we were was this. What outstanding teachers do is they have this capacity to respond to a child. No matter how the child behaves or performs, their response to the child is always adult. And this is what we call unconditional respect, which is functionally the same as unconditional love. And in fact, this is why Christianity exploded on the world scene 2,000 years ago, because they worked out that if you wanted to live well, if you wanted to help those around you to live well, then unconditionally love them. And the neuroscience says that's exactly right. Now, as we know, most of the Christian churches then shifted into conditional love, which has all a different set of outcomes. But the second thing outstanding teachers do is that they listen at the emergent and empathic levels, which allows them to grow, allows their worldview to change, their view of themselves to change, their capacity to do things to change, and they are modelling exactly what a child needs to be able to become a lifelong learner, to be able to build resilience, to be able to face up to the future. Such teachers are about 1 in 20. So the work that we do is actually how do you create the conditions in a school for more teachers to be like outstanding teachers more of the time, which is a sustainable way of raising student outcomes. Now, if we look at the average teacher in a school, then the average teacher, in terms of respect and listening, offers conditional two-way respect to children. That is, if you do what I want you to do, I'll be good to you. But if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to punish or withhold you in some way. Now, conditional respect allows the teacher to listen in different ways. And if you combine conditional respect with downloading, that is typically what a teacher will offer to a disfavoured child. So a child who doesn't know how to behave, who can't do the work, then if the teacher listens to them in a downloading way, they are essentially modelling to that child that downloading is the way that an adult listens, and that child will fail at school if enough teachers do this. In the UK they call them NEETs, not in education, employment or training, and they represent about 30% of young people. The head of the OECD education the other day, he was giving a speech and he said if you ran a supermarket and 30% of your customers came into the supermarket, didn't buy anything and walked out again, then you'd probably consider reviewing what it is that you've got on your shelves. Yet children turn up to education, 30% of them, certainly in the UK, end up not in education, employment or training, yet we don't do anything about it. Now, if you add conditional respect with attentive listening, which is probably by far the most common, so this is, child comes up and the teacher says, yes, I can see what you've done, now go away and do what I've told you to do, which I certainly remember very vividly from my own childhood. This will model to the child attentive listening. So in fact, most adults have as their default mode of listening attentive listening, which makes adults quite resistant to change, because attentive listening, we're not open to change. But favoured children might well get empathic and emergent listening. So the child comes up and the teacher says, hey, that's good what you've done. Have you tried doing it this way? I might give you another opportunity. And that's a sort of empathic and emergent listening. In the UK, these are called brights. That's the combination of conditional respect and empathic or emergent listening. You've got children who are cognitively very well developed, but who lack resilience. So as soon as anything occurs, they fall apart. So how a teacher listens to a child can literally shape the lifetime outcomes for that child. And our education systems quite systematically are creating different groups of children who fall into the failure, unable to change, or difficult to change through life. Those who are cognitively very well developed, but who lack resilience. So the question then is, are we listening to our children? Well, technically, yes, we are. But are we listening to our children at an institutional and a structural way, which is most useful to preparing our children for an uncertain future? And the answer most emphatically is no, we are not. No, we are not. Now, there's one big piece that I want to do next, which is about, well, why? If it's so obvious that listening at the empathic and emergent levels is valuable to everybody concerned, why aren't we doing it? So why aren't we listening to our children? But before we do that, I'd like to wrap up on this. So in little groups of 3 or 4, can you discuss what questions you've got, what clarifications you might need, or indeed what statements you'd like to make about this whole idea of the outstanding teacher and how they listen, the average teacher and how they listen? So go.
ideas of getting through as well. And I'm
So does anybody have any questions or any clarifications or indeed statements you'd like to make about what we've heard so far?
What do you see as being a major factor in stopping a new teacher from becoming the good teacher? Why don't they all do it? Now that we know that this is what's necessary, why doesn't it happen?
Well, when I've spoken to outstanding teachers, I've interviewed quite a lot, and asked them, how do you come to be the way you are? It's always been a particular family background, or they've had a teacher that they wanted to emulate, or interestingly, they had a teacher that they didn't want to emulate. But it's always been despite the system, not because of the system. And in fact, I'm going to show you in a moment why we are where we are and why it's taken so hard to change. But for the first time ever, and I've been doing this sort of work for 10 years now, for the first time ever, I can smell an institutional change coming. And when it does come, it will cause a massive uplift in productivity, essentially, in our ability to be creative, to be collaborative, to solve the problems that are facing the world. The research says that a child who's been severely damaged, so if you come from a background where your parents, or indeed a single parent, models to you downloading for the first 3 or 4 years of your life, such that that's the only way you know how to engage with the world, then it only requires one adult who genuinely cares, that is, who listens at this way, to allow that child to grow back into a more normal range of capabilities. There can be some permanent damage. Our brains need cognitive stimulation. If they're not getting it, then we simply don't create the networks within the brain. But given where the child is at any particular point, they can always grow constructively from that point in the right environment.
The exercises are all based around one-to-one interactions, but in a teaching situation, you're really in that situation. So, isn't much of the problems around you have multiple children in the class and multiple students in the lecture theatre, and to actually identify, to be able to model this kind of behaviour to every child or every young adult in a class setting, challenging in that sense.
Yeah, an excellent question about how do we do this in a setting with multiple people. We know that an outstanding teacher can stand on the threshold of a classroom and every child in that class go, I should pay attention to this person. So it is who the person is that causes what takes place. And then obviously you have issues about you're speaking to individual children. But it's that capacity of the teacher's being to cause children to want to pay attention that actually gives you a massive amount of the benefit. So it's at that level that we're operating. And then you've got simply the same issues that you've got 30 children in a class. But if all of those children want to go out of their way not to disappoint you or let you down, which is a consequence of this, then it makes it much easier to handle those.
So it may actually be that through a series of one-to-one interactions with a child, they actually gain the experience to listen more attentively to a teacher. So that it's a kind of, they've gained respect through an individual interaction that leads to a...
And they will also observe a teacher. So if you do something which in my normal household environment, I would just punch you, but the teacher responds in an adult way, I as a child unconsciously am thinking, oh, that's a way that you can respond to that, as opposed to punching somebody. So the teacher is modelling a way to behave which is more successful, and children naturally will adopt that.
So their emergent listening skills transfer into their charisma? Is that what you're saying there?
We like to use the word presence. Okay. That is, they are fully present in the moment. That is, all of their attention is available to the children. And to respect that, children pay attention to the teacher in turn. So charisma is one facet of that, but presence is, if you listen at this way, if you respond unconditionally to people, then you have presence. People will pay attention to you if you do that.
To what degree do you think that the specialisation and atomisation of teaching, which means that you see particular teachers for less amount of time and you have more teachers, means that teachers are more likely to choose downloading attentive listening because of its short-term benefits and not worry about, you know, the more long-term payoffs that the other forms of listening will bring about?
Well, I'll show you in a minute that our system was designed to avoid empathic and emergent listening completely. So what we have today is what we have today because it was designed to be like that. So it's not the cause, it's what it's designed to do. So if you change the underlying culture in a school, you can still have the same teaching, but over time people will change the way that teaching takes place. So team teaching is a direction in which people go as they begin to move down this direction. So as you change the culture, the teaching itself will change. How it does will change as well. Yeah.
When you are listening and you find yourself that you are listening and downloading in an attentive manner, how can you then switch into empathic and emergent listening?
Yeah. The way I do it is simply to shift my attention to the other person. So look at the hair, their eyes, or whatever it is. And that starves certainly my emotions, so dislike or boring or feeling responsible for the other person. It starves all of that, of the resources, glucose and oxygen that the brain needs, and therefore those disappear. And my attention then is my brain is able to take in what's being said. Obviously it takes practice, but I find now that when I find myself drifting, just shift my attention and then it all comes back again. So what I'd like to answer now is, well, why are we here? In the sense of why are we in this point in time? Now, you may or may not be aware, but state compulsory schooling was designed by the Prussians, which was a militarised religious state in Northern Europe, now part of modern Germany, in the period 1806 to 1819. And they designed a three-tier system. The top tier was for 0.5% of the population, second tier was for 5.5% of the population, and the bottom tier was for 94% of the population. So the bulk of the population went through this tier. This was enacted by law in 1819 in Prussia and then was rapidly and widely copied through the Western world. And so 19th century education, began in 1819, was organised around obedience. So its central promise, or central threat really, is if you don't do as you're told, you'll be punished. So it evokes images of harsh discipline, rote learning. Now the effect on the brain, the effect on the childhood mind, is to hold the child in the childhood mind as the brain physically develops into adulthood. So what it does is it limits the adult's cognitive development. It makes them habitual and obedient and anxious without certainty, which is perfect for large-scale military and for simple industrialization to take place. And the mind state of the teacher in the classroom is clearly red zone. That is hyper alert for any infraction and then massive violence in response to that infraction. So this education system produced habitual, obedient adults. To make those adults productive, then a style of leadership developed, called first generation leadership. This was authoritarian, demanded and enforced obedience. So floggings and hangings were common in militaries, in military at least, not necessarily in companies. But obedience was demanded and enforced. This reached its sell-by date around the First World War. In fact, you had two very large groups of obedient people who destroyed each other through the First World War. An interregnum between the wars. And then this was replaced, post the Second World War, by the system that we have now, and that was the second tier in the original Prussian design. This was designed to produce the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers, people who would support the state and who were cognitively well developed.
John, the first slide says 1980. Do you mean 1918?
No, 1980.
Okay, so they overlap.
Yeah. Right. I would put the end of obedience as the prohibitions on corporal punishment, which took place in the early 80s. Okay. So obedience has had a long innings, definitely had a long innings. So conformance began to emerge post the First World War and then became dominant post the Second World War. And its central promise is, if you do as you are told, you will be supported. And at the macro level, that support was the welfare state. Do as you're told, you'll have a job for life, social security, you don't have a job, a pension, affordable healthcare, and all you have to do is do as you're told. And at the classroom level, the effect is to, when the child is doing as they're told, what they're told to do is to engage with interesting and challenging curriculum, and we see cognitive development take place. But if the child doesn't conform, then there is, certainly up to 1980, physical punishment, and post-1980, other forms of punishment, which keeps the childhood mind alive. So this produces adults who are cognitively well developed, but risk-averse and uncreative. That is, get to the boundaries of what's acceptable, they become anxious and won't step over those boundaries. Now, from the late 70s onwards, the support systems for this began to break down. And as we see now, the assaults on social security and pensions are heating up, particularly if you look at the US. So this is beginning to fail. Now, it's surprising, but the mind state of the teacher under our existing system is also red zone, which is odd, because we want the children to be operating in the adult mind state. We want them to engage with interesting and challenging content, but the teacher themselves is still hyper alert for any infraction and then will respond typically in a red zone way to that infraction. Now this has two serious implications. One is the teacher is modelling to the child that when you're in a position of authority, you operate in the red zone. So we end up with adults who are not able to have mature relationships with other adults, and when in positions of authority tend to operate in the red zone. So we have cognitively bright but uncreative and uncollaborative people. But the second thing is that if you're operating in the red zone in the classroom, it means that you don't do any higher order learning. So teachers don't learn in the classroom. Now professionals learn on the job. That's one of the characteristics of a profession. So teachers are spending 4 or 5 hours a day in the classroom not learning. And so that's one of the problems that our education system is not doing well, because teachers are not learning when they should be. Outstanding teachers do learn in the classroom. And that makes them even more outstanding because they are learning faster than their peers, as well as having children wanting to pay attention to them at the same time. Now this is failing at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So if you go to the western suburbs of Sydney or Melbourne or a sinker state in the UK and say to a child, just do as you're told and you'll have a good life, then they will laugh you out of the room. At the top end of the socioeconomic spectrum, this is still valid. If you go to an elite school, do as you're told you'll have a good life, is still valid. But at the bottom end, it's not. And so at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum, children are rejecting this, and that rejection is expressed by a disengagement with curriculum. So we're seeing stagnating or declining academic outcomes, and a rejection of the teacher themselves. So we're seeing an increase in negative behaviour taking place.
Isn't it also the East Asian model, the Chinese, Japan, Korean model of cram schooling and et cetera, and that's sort of becoming more and more prevalent in Australia as a result of these limited places for selective high schools and those sorts of things?
All of the headline reforms in education today are trying to make conformance work, but it's broken. It cannot work.
The point system, the mark system, those sorts of things, Okay.
If you've got people who are cognitively bright, uncreative and uncollaborative, then the types of leaders, second generation leaders, is really a variation on first generation leaders. It's all about communication. You want to communicate to people what it is that you want done. And if those people contribute, then you support them. And if they don't contribute, then you punish them in some way by excluding them or not giving them a raise or whatever it might be. So that's second generation leadership. So what's emerging out of this is what was the top tier in the Prussian system, and that was to create children who could think and act for themselves. So in the Prussian system, it was to create the elite. And so its central promise is, we will help you fully develop. And the way you help a child to fully develop is to have an outstanding teacher. That is a teacher who responds to them with unconditional respect and who listens to them at the emergent and empathic levels. So we need a teacher operating in the blue zone. And we're finding emerging third generation leadership. So leaders who create the conditions for others to be successful in a similar way that a coach might do. So the core problem in our education system then is this. How do we move a teacher from operating in the red zone in the classroom to operating in the blue zone in the classroom? And that we can do quite systematically by shifting the culture in the school and shifting the practices within that. But as I say, all the headline processes at the moment, all the headline reforms are about trying to make conformance work when it cannot work, as opposed to helping the birth of a new form of education. Now, when we shifted from obedience to conformance, obedience reached its sell-by date by the First World War. An institutional change didn't come until the late 40s, 30 years later. So I would say that the system that's emerging now began in the early 80s. So we are now 30 years into this change taking place. And I think I can now, as I said earlier, begin to smell the fact that an institutional change is coming. An institutional change is an institution saying, this is what education is for. It's about producing adults who can face up to an uncertain future with all of their faculties available to them, who are optimistic, collaborative, creative, and resilient. That's what the education system is for, and we're going to organise ourselves to produce that, as opposed to we want to produce cognitively bright adults who otherwise will do as they're told and who are uncreative and uncollaborative. So that is the change that I can see coming.
Will there be another, like the fourth generation? Would there be another?
That's a good question. It turns out there are 3 stable ways of developing a human, and these are those 3 stable ways. So it's not obvious that there will be a fourth, because this does allow a full development of a child.
And will that keep us in the blue, and we won't go back in the red?
Well, there's a good question. And that really then leads us to this fact that we've all been brought up under that left-hand system, that is, teachers who offered us conditional respect, who at various times listened to us at the downloading, attentive listening, sometimes at the empathic and emergent, and that has shaped the way that we engage with others, how we respond to them and how we listen to them. But to be able to face up to an uncertain future, we need to be able to shift to the right. Particularly, we need our children to grow up that way. And the most useful thing that we can do is to model these ways of responding and these ways of listening to our children, at the same time as we try to make the institutional reforms that allow this to happen naturally, as opposed to happen despite the system, not because of the system. So that's all that I'd like to talk about this afternoon. Any final questions or clarifications or statements before we bring this to a close? Yes?
Well, what you've said has made sense to me. It actually reiterates something I've read by an author called Dan Pink, who I actually saw speak in the States. And you're talking about teaching, and likewise he says in his booklet about motivation. And the way to motivate people is to have mastery, purpose, and I forgot what the A is now. Autonomy. Right. So obviously a few people have read this. And that the education system was based around bringing a lot of people working in the countryside into an urban environment very quickly. So it's downloading information to make people work to generate money. But when that works well for at a certain skill set, but when you can send jobs offshore that people can do in a very manual way, you need another way to teach a population. So if we want to do high-level work, we have to have a creative workforce, and I agree with you, we're not really teaching people how to be creative. So, yeah, well done. I mean, it's exactly, makes complete sense. The question is, how do we do it? And should the focus only be on teachers? I mean, it strikes me that you know, kids are in the classroom for maybe 5 or 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. There's probably not enough hours with the parents, and there's also an awful lot of pre and after school care. So, you know, is this not the type of thing that should be rolled out to parents, to other caregivers, and something that adults should be taught beyond just teachers?
Yeah, it's a very good observation. When we started this work, we realised that there were two systemic problems in education. One was the work that teachers do, and that's what I've talked about today. And the second is the alienation of parents from the education of their children. And you need to solve both of those problems. But there is a sequence. You need to solve this one first to be able to solve the second one, which is why we focused on this one. But you're exactly right. This is a societal change that we're seeing, not just an educational change, but education is the trigger for this. If we keep trying to churn out conforming adults, then we limit the capacity of society to change. Once we start creating optimistic, collaborative, creative, resilient children, then we'll begin to see some very, very rapid change taking place.
John, can I just ask you about attention deficit disorders?
Yeah.
Ken Robinson and others have got, it tells us about conspiracy theories almost, of how it explains away lots of problems in certain areas and not in other areas. So you get these clusters of high diagnosis. You mentioned about attention as being so much important part of all of this.
Yeah.
So what's your view when schools report high levels of things like attention deficit disorder? How do you interpret that kind of data?
I think there are a number of issues in here. And Ken Robinson makes very well the point that there is overprescription of things like Ritalin to control that. My understanding of attention deficit disorder is that it is damage to the brain itself, that this part of the brain hasn't fully developed. The question is that due to particular genetics, or is that due to cultural things? Research says that for a child to grow, they need cognitive stimulation. So they need, be able to touch things, feel things, hear things, and they need somebody to nurture them, to pay attention to them. And our society has, particularly at the lower end, has lost some of those things. So whether that's an effect, I don't know. But I would expect that some of these issues would diminish as these sorts of changes begin to take place.
Have you made any studies of Montessori education, and is there any different approach or any different statistics that you're seeing there?
I haven't in any systematic way. My view is that the adults in Montessori are very similar to the adults in independent schools, in Catholic schools, in state schools, and they've all been through a system that's shaped their brains in a certain way. So I've not seen any clear evidence that they are systematically different. That is, the incidence of outstanding teachers seems to be, there aren't any more outstanding teachers in an elite independent school, for example, as for a local high school. So I've not seen any evidence to suggest that Montessori is all outstanding teachers. So they do have the curriculum is different, but is the underlying culture different? I can't say, but I don't think so. We'll put it that way.
So because the Prussian model had all three stages contained in the same society, but nonetheless modeled something that was inherently dysfunctional to us, would you then think that in our society, it would be a bad thing to have independent learning but only restricted to a certain group of people because the conformity stage also reinforces a particular power relationship between those people and others, and that the only way to go forward is to make everyone an independent learner, an independent teacher?
The reasons those three systems are stable is that they allow us to allay or assuage existential anxiety. And the first two systems need external support to do that. So under obedience, you need absolute certainty. So fundamentalists, be they religious or political, follow the same pattern. That is, absolute certainty allows me to live well without anxiety getting to grips with me. Neither of those first two sets of conditions are likely to pertain into the future. So it's very hard to say to somebody, just do as you're told, you'll have a good life, because we can no longer guarantee that. And children know that's the case. So the only form that's stable, that allows us to operate in uncertain times, is the model that builds resilience within a child, which evolution has designed us to be. We're designed to operate in the blue zone. We're not designed to be anxious and fearful and so on all of the time. It's just we've had 200 years of institutional training to trap us into that. So let's allow every human being to develop into a proper human being, and then let's see what happens, and it's likely to be a lot better than what we've got now. Let's put it that way. Because of such uncertainty, there's climate change, resource limitations, population growth, all those sorts of things. To be able to face up to that, we all need to be able to think and act for ourselves. And therefore we can't just have one group thinking and everybody else doing as they're told. It simply cannot work anymore. It has worked in the past, but it cannot work anymore.
But how widely accepted is this now? How realistic is your statement that there's going to be a big change imminent?
I think what we bring to this is the ability to put a structure and a framework and an understanding behind this. But all we're doing is describing what's actually happening. We're not saying this is what should happen, we're saying this is happening. So there has been 30 years worth of change in the education system, all driving towards this change. Now, when I started 10 years ago, I mean, there was no thought about this at all. And even 5 years ago, it was a real struggle to get people interested. But now, I go into a school, say, look, this is what we do, this is how we do it, and they go, wow, this is exactly what we need at this moment to be able to move forward. 5 years ago, that was not the case at all. So there's definitely a move, and we're definitely getting close to some sort of a transition. But it's like one of these things that you don't see it till it suddenly happens, and then once it's happened, you think, well, this is obvious. It's been 30 years in gestation, but before it happens, it's not at all obvious.
And clearly, we want to be raising, resilient, independent children. Then what role do we as parents play in that versus, irrespective of the experience that they then have at school?
Yeah. The parent plays an absolute pivotal, central role to this. And you could say that all teachers are people who spend all of their life honing and developing the skills to a very, very high degree that a parent needs to have to help their child to fully grow. And in fact, if you go to the process of integrating parents into the educative process, one of the ways that you do that is to have expert teachers helping those parents to actually get better at what they do. So the way things are moving is that the parent is absolutely central to this. If you provide cognitive stimulation and nurturing to your child in the first 12 months, you're setting them up for life. And if you model emergent listening to them during those 12 months, their ability to process information by the time that they're mid-20s will be phenomenal, prodigious.
John, can you go over that notion of emergent listening? You mentioned also a word, is it serial? You mentioned a word serial. Is it serial processing or something? Does it mean that emergent listening arises from empathy listening, where you listen to the child and you agree on what the child is saying, and you yourself come together to agree a certain course of action. Then both of you take action as a result of from that empathy thinking. Empathy listening.
Yeah. No, that's simply a process. You could say it's a coaching process. I'm going to help you to think better and therefore take a course of action. Emergent listening is simply a pathway that the brain has that allows information to come in live and connect with information that's already in your brain and come up with a new way of seeing the world, which is parallel processing. And that's almost all of my listening now is at that level. So when I'm listening to things, I just let it go past me. And at first you think, I'm not listening to anything because I'm not taking notes, I'm not remembering what people are saying. But then 3 or 4 days later, suddenly my way of looking at the world will change. And I realised that it was because of something that happened 3 or 4 days, or 4 or 5 weeks previously. So it's simply allowing a non-verbal part of the brain, which is massively more powerful than the verbal part, to get access to new information. That's what emergent is.
So where are you saying that there's no scope for critical listening? Is that what you're saying?
Critical listening in the sense of?
Well, in terms of you're getting the information, you still have to evaluate it, isn't it? You can't just absorb and accept everything that you listen as gospel. You still have to evaluate whether it's true or false. Or
maybe, because there is this thing called intuition. So if you want to buy a house, for example, the best strategy is to look at a bunch of houses and then buy the one that feels right. If you try and calculate which is the best house, in distance to schools, the number of rooms, etc., 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 you will come up with a very poor decision. So intuition is the brain's capacity to make good decisions based on a complex range of variables that it's come across before. So just look at the houses and then choose the one you feel right. You don't need to make any evaluation at all. So quite literally, emergent listening, if you allow it to happen, is extraordinarily powerful.
Is that not the childlike mind then? In the sense it's like dumbing down your neocortex to make rational decision making. Because I know there's a lot of research coming out now that your intuition is actually very good, and the majority of what you face during the day is stuff you've actually faced before, and not overanalyze it.
That's right. It's when you face a new problem that you need to do rational and rational in group. But intuition is very good for stuff that we've seen before.
And once again, thank you very much indeed, John, for a fantastic talk and session.
Thank you, Paul.